Private William Taylor would always remember the last night of Custer's life. Was it my fancy or the gathering twilight that made his face take on an expression of sadness that was new to me? Several officers said the same thing about him after a meeting on the night of the 24th of June, 1876, as if the lieutenant colonel knew the fate that awaited him the next day. But if he knew what awaited him, is he to blame for what happened? Taylor had been only 17 when he joined the military back in 1872. His entire adult life had been given to the 7th Cavalry. He'd followed Custer into battle many times before, and was no stranger to putting his life at risk. But he'd never lived through anything like what came next. As part of A Company, Taylor was assigned to Major Marcus Reno's attack on the southern end of Sitting Bull's village. They set out at noon on the 25th, parting ways with Captain Frederick Benteen's companies first and then Custer's, unaware that they would never see him alive again. Custer and Reno didn't like each other, but orders were orders. Taylor followed the major as he led them over the Little Bighorn several miles south of Sitting Bull's village and into position to strike. As they rode, he happened to look back over his shoulder to see Major Reno taking a swig of what looked like whiskey from a flask. Taylor knew better than to question his commanding officer, but the sight remained fixed in his memory for the rest of his days. What that flask contained, and effect its contents has, is not for me to say, but I have ever since had a very decided belief. Taylor would not be the only man who came to believe Reno was drunk that day. Perhaps it explained why things went so wrong. Taylor thought the battle would be an easy victory. Like the rest of the 7th Cavalry, he'd been overconfident. When I look back and think of the sublime audacity of 150 cavalrymen charging with a cheer down on the Indian village, it does seem indeed like madness. The 7th Cavalry worked in groups of 4. One man out of every 4 was nominated to hold the other 3's horses while they went off to fight. On that day, Taylor was that number 4. He thought it was a shame and wanted to be in the fight. In actuality, it might have saved his life. The troops dismounted. Taylor and the other nominated men took the horses to the shelter of some trees nearby, while the rest of the battalion advanced toward the village. Taylor was certain he was there for no more than 20 minutes. He could hear gunfire and the shouting in the distance. There were even a few stray bullets that whistled through the leaves above his head. It was only when he saw his comrades sprinting back toward him that he realized something was wrong. "We must get out of here! Quick!" they shouted, as they appeared through the trees desperately seeking their horses. They leaped atop their mounts and Taylor did the same, but only when he saw hundreds of mounted native warriors charging after them did he understand why. They all bolted for the river. As they charged out of the trees, they found the Native American riders already riding parallel to them, sending bullets and arrows into the fleeing men. Taylor remembered his training well enough to shoot back, but he never thought he hit anything. His biggest concern was surviving. As was the unwritten rule when fighting the natives, he made sure to count his shots so that he'd have 1 bullet spare for himself in case the enemy tried to capture him. Taylor reached the river alive and urged his horse onwards. He dropped his revolver somewhere but didn't dare stop to look for it. His only concern was getting to the other bank. Ignoring the bodies of his fallen comrades bobbing in the blood-red water and native warriors behind him who wanted to make him join them. His horse carried him to the far bank safely, but it could go no further. It was too exhausting. Taylor would have to climb the steep hill on foot as hundreds of enemy warriors took pot shots at him. They were terrifying. They seemed to us, in all their hideousness of paint and feathers, and wild fierce cries, like fiends incarnate. Bullets pelted the ground around him, sending little puffs of dust into the air as he climbed. Death could come at any second. About a third of the way up the hill, he was overtaken by another soldier. Private William Myers had barely walked a few feet ahead before a Sioux bullet went through his head. Behind him, the enemy whooped and cheered. Taylor's body had almost given out when another soldier rode over with a fresh horse for him. He wasted no time climbing into the saddle and riding up the last stretch of the hill, where he found the rest of Reno's battered command. There, already safe and sound, was Major Reno himself. Some officers would consider it wrong to rush themselves to safety while leaving their men behind, but clearly Reno was not such an officer. Was Reno a coward? Given what happened next, many men came to think he was. To their great relief, the Native Americans did not pursue them once they reached the top of the bluffs. They were beyond thankful for it at the time. Only later would they realize that their enemy had broken off to meet Custer's attack on the other end of the village. Their battalion was in a terrible state. They were down at least 30 men, with many others injured. Everyone was exhausted and shaken. In their mad retreat, some had lost horses. Men like Taylor had lost weapons. and even Major Reno had lost his officer's hat. The major instead tied a red handkerchief around his head, giving him what Taylor called a rather peculiar and unmilitary appearance. They remained on that hill until Captain Benteen's men arrived a while later. The sight of reinforcements was a welcome one, but by now the survivors were growing concerned for the fate of Custer's command. The men were anxious to get moving in case their comrades needed help. "Why don't we move?" was the question on everyone's lips. Instead, Benteen and Reno waited over an hour. No aspect of the battle has attracted so much debate as this. Custer had sent a messenger with written orders for Benteen to bring up reinforcements to him, but those orders also said to bring the pack train for ammo and supplies, which did not arrive at Reno Hill for some time after Benteen. Strategically, this may have been a sound move, but for the men on Reno Hill, it almost felt like cowardice. Should Reno and Benteen have gone ahead with their reinforcements anyway? Taylor wasn't sure, but he figured that any officer would have known that Custer was in trouble and needed help sooner rather than later. But he was a lowly private, so like the rest of the men, he kept his mouth shut and waited like he was told. Taylor and the other men on Reno Hill would wonder for the rest of their lives if things might have changed if they hadn't. The pack train under Captain Thomas McDougal finally arrived a little before 5 p.m. Shortly after, Benteen and Reno gave the orders to fall in and prepare to march for Custer. The advanced troops under Captain Thomas Weir went ahead to scout the way with the main force following behind them. Weir's men made it as far as an outlook, where they could see innumerable warriors moving over a field in the distance. They did not know that their own comrades were lying dead on that same field. The Sioux and Cheyenne quickly spotted Weir's scouts and gave the order to charge. When word reached Benteen and Reno, they ordered a full retreat back to the hill they'd started on. Custer would have to fend for himself. The men had no choice but to make Reno Hill their last stand. A depression in the center provided shelter for the wounded and the horses, but there was little else. The men had managed to keep low and scrape together piles of dirt or dig shallow ditches for themselves. The companies arranged themselves a circular defensive formation to protect the hill from all sides. Taylor and A Company got the southeast, facing away from the river and the village. Fortunately for Taylor, it was probably the least dangerous sector to guard. The Native Americans took positions in the hills around them to open fire at a distance, while others came close to assault the positions before dashing away on their horses. They refused to give the Americans a moment's rest. Taylor would wonder for the rest of his life why the enemy did not mount a full charge on Reno Hill. As he would soon learn, those same tactics had already allowed the enemy to annihilate Custer. Had they tried it, Taylor was certain it would have worked again. It was indeed most fortunate for us that they did not, he wrote. The gunfire faded as night fell. Stray shots here and there ensured the men were kept alert. An uncomfortable silence descended over the hills after hours of relentless battle. Neither Taylor nor his comrades dared to break the silence by asking the obvious questions. Where was Custer? What had happened to him? Was he even alive? He didn't ask, and he pretended that he didn't already know the answer. Under cover of night, the Americans tried to send scouts to locate Custer, but they returned quickly, saying it was impossible as the hills were full of the enemy. A trumpeter was ordered to sound off calls in Custer's direction, praying that the echoing sound would reach their lost comrades. The call the trumpeter used was taps, which was used to signal lights out at the end of the day, and was often played at a soldier's grave. Unthinkingly, but how appropriately, no answering call came to our anxious ears. There was little sleep that night. Taylor was restless and wanted to do something. A man of his rank would rarely be told anything, so he asked his company's First Sergeant Feller, "What are we going to do? Stay here all night, or try to move away?" Unfortunately, Major Reno overheard the question. "I would like to know how in the hell we are going to move away," the angry major interrupted. Taylor could not talk back to a superior officer, so instead suggested they should build a barricade of some kind since their current defenses were poor. The suggestion seemed to calm Reno down, and he ordered it done. The men stacked boxes and other items from their wagon train, and by 10 p.m. had a decent barricade set up at A Company's position. They manned the barricade in 2-hour shifts. Taylor took the second watch. No attack came, but all through the night he could hear the chilling cries of celebration and mourning from the village below. Among the noise was a single bugle. It was known that G Company's trumpeter had died in Reno's attack, and the men prayed that the bugle had been his. They all knew what it meant if it had come for Custer's men instead. The Native Americans resumed their attacks around 3 a.m. the next morning. Taylor and the other survivors found themselves on the defensive against a combination of distant snipers and daring close-range charges that tried but failed to break their lines. The barricades served as excellent cover to return fire upon the attacks, and formed a formidable barrier that the Native Americans decided not to assault directly. Seeing the success of A Company's barricade, Captain Benteen came over later in the morning and asked to borrow some of their boxes for his own H Company. The barricade was longer than A Company needed, so they agreed to spare some of it. Why it had taken Benteen so long to realize such a defense would be a good idea was an unanswered question. Then again, for all the criticisms he had of Benteen, Taylor could not accuse the man of cowardice. Benteen never once flinched under fire, even as Taylor watched bullets strike the ground a few feet from where the captain was standing. Taylor returned to the barricade to help the defense. He exchanged fire with distant Native American snipers, but neither he nor his targets took any hits. The same could not be said for his comrades. One man, a civilian packer named Frank Mann, who had been forced to take up arms to help the defense, had only poked his head above the barricade for a second when a bullet got him between the eyes. He fell back dead right next to Taylor. Tragic as his fate was, there was no time to mourn him while they were fighting for their lives. After dragging the body away, Taylor made sure to take the man's revolver to replace the one he'd lost the previous day. But with so many men against them, there was a growing sense that it was a losing fight. I think that most of the soldiers felt that unless a special providence intervened, we were certainly doomed. If the bullets didn't kill them, then thirst might. Most of the men had gone 24 hours without water, and by midday on the 26th were growing desperate. They tried every method to try to suppress their thirst, chewing lead from a bullet, or the leaves of the prickly pears that grew wild in the area, or the old trick of sucking on pebbles. All were useless if not an aggravation, Taylor said. Not long after noon, Benteen issued a call for volunteers to force a run down the river to fetch water. He received a chorus of eager volunteers. Although Taylor wasn't selected for the duty, the finest sharpshooters who were still standing rushed to the western edge of the hill to suppress the enemy shooters on the far side of the river, while a squad of brave troopers tried cutting through the ravine. This undertaking seemed to me at the time a foolish one, Taylor later admitted, but the water parties succeeded in their mission despite the odds. Between noon and 2 p.m., the enemy fire dwindled. The men began to think the fight was wrapping up, but Taylor thinks that was the point. The men began to leave their defensive positions and walk around, only for the fire to suddenly resume. A few of the men were hit in the sudden barrage, but it was the last card the Native Americans had to play. Miles away, Sioux scouts had spotted the approach of a fresh column of American troops. Sitting Bull's people took this as a signal to pack up their village and withdraw to the safety of the mountains to the west. The enemy fire dwindled into nothing over the next hour or so. At last, it was safe enough for the men to peer over the hills and watch as the great mass of thousands of natives marched away. For those men who had just endured 2 days of horror and sacrifice, it was a godsend. It was the most joyful sight to us, Taylor later wrote. They had survived the hardest fight of their lives. I doubt if a dirtier, more haggard-looking lot of men ever wore the army blue than that little remnant of the once proud 7th. Battered and bruised as they were still alive. They would soon learn just how few of the 7th Cavalry could say the same. In mid-morning on the 27th, the survivors of the 7th Cavalry spotted a dust cloud approaching them from the north. Some feared it was the Native Americans returning, while others clung to the hope that Custer and his men were finally returning. It was actually a combined force of General Alfred Terry and John Gibbon, arriving for their planned rendezvous with Custer. They were met with cheers from the beleaguered men of the 7th, but the grim expression on the newcomers' faces quickly ruined the mood. En route, they had passed by a battlefield some 3 miles to the north, a battlefield now littered with the lifeless bodies of Custer and his whole command. Taylor was not selected to join Benteen in inspecting the battlefield that day. It would fall to other men to locate and identify Custer and the men who died with him. Instead, Taylor helped the cleanup on Reno Hill. They dismantled their barricade and took account of their own dead. Taylor was also assigned to check the surrounding area for any signs of missing men. It was a while he was exploring just south of Reno Hill that he came across the body of a Sioux warrior slain in the battle. Something about the man stuck with Taylor. He was easily 6 foot tall and well built for a warrior. Taylor thought he looked, quote, like a bronze statue that had been thrown to the ground. Someone else had found the body already, for he'd been scalped. It was an open secret that some American soldiers took up the practice of scalping while fighting the Plains Indians. The Sioux believed the power of a warrior's soul was in his scalp. so some Americans took and destroyed them as an extra insult to their enemy. I could not help the feeling of sorrow as I stood gazing upon him, Taylor confessed. He was within a few hundred rods of his home and family which we had attempted to destroy, and he had died to defend. His body would soon be devoured by scavengers, and he would be forgotten here. Taylor took the man's medicine bag as a memento. Years later, he was able to determine that the man's name had been High Elk. It wasn't until the morning of the 28th that Taylor lay eyes on Custer's battlefield. The 7th resolved to bury the comrades before leaving. Although so few tools at hand, the burials would have to be rushed. There, Taylor witnessed the brutality and disrespect inflicted upon his fallen comrades. They were all naked, and nearly all were mutilated in some disgusting manner. Taylor heard that only Custer and Captain Miles Cogue were spared mutilation, although Taylor did not personally see either man's body to know that Custer was indeed mistreated. From the way the bodies lay, running from the foot of the hills up to the ridge, and to the two masses of men upon Calhoun and Last Stand Hill, Taylor could already imagine their final moments. The attack on the village failed and the enemy drove them back, picking off troopers slowly as they scrambled for the safety of the hilltops. Most men never made it. Those few who did, including Custer himself, found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. Rightfully or otherwise, there was at the time among the enlisted men at least a deep feeling of resentment against the general, Taylor wrote in his account years later. It was felt that their comrades had been needlessly sacrificed, and their own lives put in jeopardy, for the sake of Custer's hunger for glory. Others blamed Reno. Taylor believed the man was drunk, and came to suspect that he delayed reinforcing Custer, because he didn't want Custer to criticize him after what might be seen as a half-hearted attempt to attack the village. Had Reno placed his own interests above those men's lives? Given how quickly he got himself up Reno Hill, it would certainly be in character. Taylor did not ultimately declare who he blamed for the defeat. It would be inappropriate for a man to make such open statements about their commanding officers anyway. However, his account provides one of the best eyewitness versions of the battle, and plenty of information to try making that judgment for ourselves.